Welcome everyone. My name is Tyler Wolf, and I'm the Director of Student Wellbeing in Dublin City Schools. Thank you for attending tonight's Your Child and Healthy Relationships webinar. We're glad you're here. After the broadcast, please take a moment to complete our quick survey and provide your valuable feedback. It'll be added to the chat for easy access. If you need to process any of the subjects discussed tonight, or you're looking for resources for yourself or your family, feel free to call the Ohio Health Sexual Assault Response Network of Central Ohio's helpline at 614-267-7020. We've also created a document with all the various school districts' contact information for you. To access it, just scan the QR code on your screen. Again, welcome to the seminar.
Thank you for having us. My name is Glenn A. Harris. I'm the Assistant Director of Prevention at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I specialize in engaging young men and boys. Look forward to having a conversation with you today around healthy masculinity and gender norms. And Jeff, if you want to introduce yourself, sir.
Sure. I'm Jeff Puster, and I'm the campus-based prevention coordinator for SARNCO, and I also use he and him pronouns. So I kind of want to preface a little bit about tonight's presentation and what we're going to discuss. And I want to start off first by saying there are great and wonderful things about being a man. And we want to highlight those traits. We want to talk about those and have a great discussion around that. So we definitely want to uplift all the positive parts about being a man. And we also want to be able to discuss some traits that can be associated with masculinity that can be problematic and even violent. Because it's important to have a critical conversation so that we can evaluate the sense of masculinity and continue on that path of healthy masculinity. So Glenn, kick it back over to you.
Absolutely. To start this conversation off, I really want to kind of pretense the conversation by saying everything that we're going to discuss today is about being proactive. Being proactive about how we can prevent violence. Not reacting once the violence has occurred, but what are some things that we can do on a community level to prevent a lot of the violence that we're seeing in our communities. What I'm sharing with you now is what we call the pyramid of violence. And what the pyramid of violence essentially states is that violence doesn't just happen out of a vacuum. It starts with attitudes. Those attitudes become a bias. That bias then leads into discrimination, microaggressions, and other things of that nature. Then we get to the different forms, of bias-based violence and other violence that we see in our communities. For our conversation, we're going to focus on the lower portions of this pyramid and talk about the knowledge, the attitudes, and the beliefs that lead to some of the violent culture that we see. So the work that we do is on the prevention lane. And then when you talk about once the violence occurs, that's what we call advocacy. That's when the advocates come in and react to that particular situation. Jeff and I are going to have a conversation today about some things that we can do to prevent violence from ever occurring. To start that, let's have a conversation, and just kind of curious, Jeff, Tyler, just really quick, what would you say? How would you define masculinity? What is it?
That's a great question, and I think it's something that really for me is fluid in that I'm constantly taking it away and adding different things, different attributes and traits. Glenn and you and I have had a lot of conversations, and Tyler, you and I over the past couple of weeks, and I listened to things. I was like, I want to add that, to being a man or to my sense of masculinity. So I think of it in that way as like taking away and adding different things.
Yeah, I think we get a lot of different messages about masculinity from advertising and from social media and all these types of things. But, and some of those images and messages are positive and some are negative and some, people can adapt to or not. But I think, masculinity is something that's a personalized thing depending on your environment, your family, your job, and all that. And I think it can be defined in many different ways. I define masculinity in probably a much different way than some other people.
Absolutely, and I love those answers because you're absolutely right. Masculinity, what it looks like can change person to person, community to community. Yep. What masculinity looks like here in Columbus, Ohio is completely different what it looks like, in India or some other places of the world. So I 100% agree with you. Society oftentimes tells us that, as a man, there's a box we've got to fit in. Here are all the attributes, here are all of the things that men should be. And anything outside of that box, men are typically, we're picked on, we're ridiculed, emasculated, and that list goes on and on anytime we're ventured outside of that box. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of that today. Share 2 quotes with you guys really quick. The first one's from a gentleman by the name of Jack Donovan. He says, when someone tells a man to be a man, they mean that there is a way to be a man. Again, that man box. A man is not just a thing to be, it is also a way to be, a path to follow and a way to walk. Some try to make manhood mean everything. Others believe it means nothing at all. Being a good man can't mean everything, yet it always has meant something. I think that, history has shown us that throughout history, there's been different images that have been upheld by society to say, hey, this is manhood. And we can go back to, back in the John Wayne days, the Cowboys and Indians, like this was, he was put up as a poster child. And we continue to do that in our culture and our society. Here's another one by Trip Lee. Young men just don't know what it means to be a man. There are so many lies about what it means to be a man, whether that get a bunch of girls or get a bunch of money, don't cry, don't have emotions, but nobody is teaching them how to be men. And that's some of what we want to talk about today. How do we, in the school system, in our communities, how do we teach our young men and boys healthy masculinity? And that's a little bit what we're going to talk about. To kind of paint a picture of where some of these masculine beliefs and attitudes come from, I want to share with you guys a word doodle that we did just a few years back. So what a word doodle is a collection of words. So let me go back a little bit further. We surveyed middle school students out of the DC, Baltimore area. We partnered with an organization called Men Can Stop Rape. We interviewed those young men and boys, and we took notes and asked them to describe the type of games and activities that they enjoyed when they went outside to play on the weekend, Saturday, Sunday. You're out with your friends. What type of activities do you like? The words you see in this word doodle are the verbs and adjectives they use to describe those activities. The larger the word, obviously the more repeated that word was. Jeff, just out of curiosity, at a glance, what words jump out to you there?
Yeah, I definitely see words like battle, power, heroes, those kinds of things really pop out.
Absolutely. So, as young men and boys, we're taught that you're supposed to have power. We're taught to be in control. We're taught battle. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And think about whether it's on the football field, whether it's on the playground, just about any activity we do as young men and boys, cops and robbers, that list goes on and on. It's competition, which becomes domination, which is power, control, and this is repeated throughout, our childhood. This is what our youthful experience. On the other hand, here's a word doodle, and this is what comes up when you interview the young ladies. Here are the words that the young ladies use to describe the type of games and activities that they enjoy. What jumps out to you here, Jeff?
So, first of all, just the emotions that are in here, the words, love and magic and babies, fashion, change, friendship, those kinds of things really, and it speaks more to the emotions for me.
Absolutely. And it's a complete contrast to what our young boys are learning. And then we wonder why our young boys and girls struggle with relationships at such a young age. We're being taught 2 different things. Boys, we want to battle, we want control. Girls are like, well, just love, friendship, happy, let's do some magic. And that's not what we're being taught as young men and boys. And I think what we want to do as a culture and a society, as much as possible, is start to blur those lines a little bit so that our boys do get some of those experiences on the other side. So our young ladies get some of the experiences on the other side. And I think that makes for more well-rounded individuals. Some of what you see in some of these patterns, they lead to what we call patriarchy. And it's these attitudes of control, power, domination, especially when it pertains to women and children. When it pertains to, those men that we see outside the man box, how do we dominate them? How do we, that's kind of this attitude and spirit that we grow up as young men and boys. I'm going to go back to something Jeff said earlier. There's nothing bad, innately bad about being a male. It's more about these toxic behaviors you see at the bottom of the screen that we want to highlight and talk about that typically only come out in male-dominated spaces, where we as men are competing against one another on that echelon of manhood. I want to prove or get higher up that list of manhood, so I'm going to display some of this toxic behavior to push myself up that ladder a little bit. Just very quickly, I want to ask both of you guys. I'm going to show an image on the screen, and you'll see a man wearing a T-shirt. And I'm just kind of curious if you can tell me what you guys call that T-shirt in your community. What do you guys call that?
Yeah, I mean, that's commonly known as a wife beater.
Yep.
Have you ever thought why? And think about what that says to our young boys and girls. Language has power. So when I'm walking around calling a shirt a wife beater, I've got a young daughter who's 8 years old. I don't want her walking around for the next 10, 12 years hearing wife beater, wife beater, wife beater, and it's normalized. So then she finds herself in that situation and says, I've heard this my whole life. I guess this is normal. Wives get beat. You know, we have to be conscious of a culture, what we normalize and how violence is normalized. Jeff, really quickly before I pass it over to you, and you'll be right up next, as I did want to take a moment and kind of share just a personal story and show the audience how some of this toxic masculinity plays out in a real world setting. I'm actually going to take my academic experience as an example. So growing up through middle school, elementary, I was gifted and talented. Straight A student, always A's and B's. I was in, advanced accelerated classes, the whole 9 yards. I was also pretty gifted in sports. I played football, basketball, and I loved soccer. Soccer was like one of my hugest sports, right? In my community, not a lot of African-American boys play soccer, so I was a little bit of an anomaly, but I loved it, enjoyed it, right? Funny thing happened my freshman year of high school. Football and soccer are both fall sports. They happen at the same time. So I approached the school I was going to and I said, hey, coach, I want to play both sports. And I worked it out with the coaches. Everything was great. Showed up my first day of what we call two-a-days. So before school starts, you got those 2 practices in a day. That morning, I show up, I'm practicing with varsity, practicing with the big boys. We break for lunch. Going in for lunch, I have my lunch, and I start taking my pads off. Well, the kids are like, what are you doing? There's a whole nother practice. Why are you taking those pads off? You might as well keep those on. There's a whole nother practice. And I'm like, no, I play soccer too. I'm going to go play and practice soccer for the second half. Oh, he's going to go play with the girls. All the jokes started. Guess what? I never made it to soccer practice that day. Not only did I not make it to soccer practice, I never played soccer again. Not only did I never play soccer again, that's me right there, turning around looking over at the soccer field at all the friends that I left behind, that I turned my back on because the other guys were telling me this isn't the manly thing to do. So this is how this toxic masculinity plays out in our culture. It prevents many of our young men and boys from becoming who they innately are. I don't know, I could have been the next Pele, and that was taken from me. So I'll stop there. Any thoughts, comments that you guys have about anything that I just said about that personal story? Does that strike a chord? Can you guys think about a time where you had to compromise who you really were in order just to fit in with the other boys?
Definitely. I can think of a number of examples. But I want to say real quickly, because one thing that popped in my mind, as we have our conversation, we have these conversations with our own kids and our own young boys, our own children, and Tyler, will get with you on from an academic perspective. But as we have these conversations, your story is so impactful. It has so much to it, and I think that's such a great way to start a conversation with our own kids.
Absolutely.
Right? Like this happened to me, because oftentimes kids aren't thinking that long term, right? Because their frontal lobe's not developed yet, so they're not thinking necessarily in that way. But as we start to share those examples and be able to say, hey, this is what I experienced. And when you say, these boys, they made fun of me, they joked with me, and what that did, I think so many of our boys can relate to that in all kinds of ways.
Absolutely.
And with their own life and growing up, because we're not there to shield them at school or out on the playground or whatever that may be. So I think that's so important to be able to open up a conversation by saying, hey, I want to talk about what I experienced, and then maybe get them to open up about, well, this is happening to me, and kind of work through that.
Absolutely. Jeff, I come from the fatherhood community. I've done a lot of work in the fatherhood arena and working with, the men in our community and in their role as parents and as fathers. A lot of it starts in the home. We have to set a tone. I think as a culture and as a society, we typically champion young men and boys when it comes to athletics, when it comes to things like that, right? Just a few months ago, my son came in second place in the science fair, and I act like he just won a Super Bowl. Like, I had to lift that up to let him know this is just as big as you scoring a touchdown. And we have to make sure that as a culture, we're doing that with our young men and boys. Yep. We'll do that with our girls, not so much with our young men and boys. And we have to do that extra step.
Tyler, what do you think from an academic or professional educator perspective?
Yeah, I think the just a lot of things that Glenn had mentioned about the the young boys and how impressionable they are, and how much they're influenced by older students and by older kids who may have certain stereotypes about manhood or masculinity, and you've got to be tough, you've got to do the manly sports, and you've got to do X, Y, and Z if you really want to prove yourself as a man. Where in schools we can help get to know kids and really help to foster their own interests and their own directions, because there are many kids, many young boys who have strong interests in things that aren't particularly considered manly things, whether it's music or theater or whatever, and can be very successful and have extreme talent in those things and still be every bit as much of a man as the one who's playing football or any kind of other super athletic sport.
Excellent. Great point. I want to advance over to, because Glenn, you talked about power, like how some of the boys in your situation, in your personal story, basically had power over because they influenced your decision on things. So I want to talk a little bit about power and control and how that relates to violence and violence prevention too. So I kind of hesitated about using the power and control wheel. And some of you out there, professionals, educators, maybe even some parents, may be familiar with this, but I was hesitant because this may be a little bit unrelatable for folks. So I do want to break it down a little bit and kind of describe it in a way that may make it more relatable. So I want to look at one of these behaviors. Well, first of all these behaviors, all these things we see in the pie shape around are being used and are a tool or a trait that's being used to exert power and control over another person. Now, in situations where it's an unhealthy relationship or even a violent, abusive relationship, we may not see all of these. And oftentimes, out in the public, so to speak, we won't see these. Oftentimes, these behaviors are behind closed doors, so to speak. But I do want to talk about a couple of these and give some examples. And I was looking at these today, and I was looking at minimizing. And I was kind of thinking about my own situation and just using an example of doing the laundry at home and how I don't like to do laundry. And we could talk a lot about that, but just thinking about these conversations with my wife about laundry and minimizing some things on my end, just saying it's not that big of a deal or just minimizing my part of it. And I think it's important to have that awareness of that, but I want to contrast that kind of situation with something else. And let's say there's an example of if I was to call my wife a derogatory, offensive name, right? Something that's really mean and that's upsetting to her. She's upset and she's telling me she's upset. And if I was to react in a way by saying, why are you getting so upset? It's not that big of a deal. Why do you always make it such a big deal? It was just a joke, right? That's much different than the conversation about the laundry. Because what I'm doing is exerting power and control. And I want to talk about a couple things with that. One is I'm telling her I have the right to say that to you and to call you that name. And the second thing I'm telling her is you don't have the right to be upset for that. You don't have the right to push back on that. And that is what is violence, and that is what is abuse. And so that's just one example on this power and control wheel. I want to hit on a little bit on coercion and talk a little bit about that, coercion and threats. I think it's important that we have these conversations about what that really is. That is manipulation. Manipulating another person in order to get your own needs met. And that could be through physical violence or even sexual violence. So coercion may look like verbal manipulation. if you really loved me, if you really cared for me, you would do these things. It can also look like, if you leave me, I may hurt myself or I may kill myself. How suicide, or the threat of suicide rather, may be used in that kind of way, and that's a really important discussion to have. But it also could be physical coercion. It could be a slight bit of force that's being used, maybe holding the shoulder down, holding the elbow, those kinds of things, in which to, again, facilitate some kind of assault, such as sexual assault. So this power and control wheel, as I said, it may be unrelatable, but as you kind of get in and look at this, it may be something that you use. I think there's something that may be used from a professional standpoint, but also maybe parents can kind of get in and look at this. And Glenn, I want to look at, get back to you on this, because that may not be something that you're going to say to your child, hey, let's talk about this power and control wheel. And I want to flip it on its head a little bit. So instead of looking at these power and control, these problematic, abusive behaviors, how might you turn this around and use it, talk about it in a more positive way with your kids?
For me, it's more so about finding real world scenarios that they can relate to have the conversation. Looking for opportunities where if I see any of these behaviors arise, taking that opportunity to have the conversation. Good example I could use is my oldest son is 18. He's a senior in high school, but he's had access to a vehicle since he was 16. Amongst a lot of his peer groups, he was the only one with a vehicle. So that creates a little bit of privilege. And if I see you flexing that privilege a little bit, you know what I mean? I'm going to have a conversation with you to make sure you understand the dangers with that and how that is harmful to others. You should not be using, whether it's your material assets or other assets, to lure people or to bait people to do the things that you want them to do. So it's about finding those opportunities, real world opportunities, to have those conversations so it lands home. I think oftentimes with kids, when you have those conversations that are like pie in the sky type conversations, they're like, yeah, okay, whatever, and don't sometimes get it. They walk away and the message doesn't sink in. But when there's something tangible they can point to or touch, it's a lot easier to have that conversation and have it land home.
Yeah. So Tyler, come over to you. Looking at this diagram, how might that be used in an educational setting?
So I look at this the wheel, and I think about teachable moments in school situations. And in any classroom or school, there's a lot of social interaction. A lot of that social interaction has to do with hierarchies of power, and status among peer groups and between peer groups. So I look at some of the things on there, like intimidation and isolation, using privilege, and a lot of those things perhaps are used by students to elevate their status in their peer groups.
Absolutely.
So I think also we can take the opportunities to help kids identify those things and talk about them, and so that other people can be called out on it. If someone is being bullied or intimidated, or someone's being left out, or using their privilege as a status way to gain status. And if we make kids aware of that and use situations that they experience in their own lives and at school, I think it can help them to resolve some of those conflicts and maybe avoid some of these power and control issues that take place.
I love that both of you pointed out like real world examples and taken and seizing the moment.
Absolutely.
And I think that's so important, not only for educators, but also parents, is to be able to stop in that moment and say, hey, let's discuss this. Positive and negative, on both sides of it. Because if we see something where a child is, let's say, giving power to another child in some kind of way, to be able to say, that was great. I think that was wonderful what you did, and point that out to them, right? Because I think we want to always emphasize the behaviors that we want to see out of kids. So I love your examples.
One other thing I'd like to mention is, we don't talk much about bystanders. There are many times where there are students who are bystanders to certain situations or conflicts, and the bystanders can recognize these, be that third party to help intervene and resolve the conflict or make the situation a little bit more equitable.
Good point.
I'm so happy you said that, Tyler, because I was actually just going to mention the same thing when you talk, using bystander intervention. Like, it's great to find those allies and the individuals in your community that are always going to lift up the right thing, positive thing, Yeah. I think another thing with this power and control wheel, it's very important for us to get out of the the habit of, when we talk about violence, sticking in that narrow frame of just physical violence. Like, violence is so much bigger than just the physical. Like, nothing you see up here is really physical. These are either mental, emotional, these are those types of things. And we have to be aware as a society that violence is a lot bigger than just the physical.
Good point. Let's, I'm going to go into the next part right now. And I want to talk about consent. And what I want to say, first of all, those behaviors, those characteristics that we saw on the power and control wheel, when those are present, when those are being used in some kind of way, it negates consent. So if a person is using those behaviors on the power and control wheel, they are taking consent away from a person. Consent's not possible. Coercion, for example. If you're using manipulative tactics, manipulative statements, whatever that may be, then again, consent is not possible. Now, how we oftentimes talk about consent, not talk about it, but just give an acronym or give a little saying so that it's easier to have that discussion. And we use this acronym called FRIES. And I want to start out with, I won't read all of these off, you can see it on the screen, how we talk about it, but consent needs to be something that's fluid, it's ongoing. Freely given is important because, again, if a person is being coerced and manipulated, then you can't freely give consent, and that's important to be able to say. So there's a lot of, there's these 5 traits up there, and we get into some pretty good discussions about that when we do these in trainings, so to speak. But I want to take this, and again, Glenn, you may not necessarily say, hey, let's talk about FRIES and go through it, but just some of these things. How might a parent, or as a parent, have a conversation with a young child, such as a boy, about consent?
Yeah, I would kind of take it away from the sexual experience and almost like, so I've got boys in my house, and I would say to one boy, if Dom wants to come into your room and borrow something, he has to get consent. He can't just walk in your room and take it, you know what I mean? He has to be able to say, hey, do you mind if I borrow your Xbox controller? Outside of that, there's an issue there. There's a problem there. Same thing with your sexual experiences. Like, you cannot just have sex with someone unless there's a mutual understanding, a mutual agreement, and some sort of consent saying, yeah, like, I do want to go forward with this. And consent, I think the hard part having conversation, especially with boys, is that consent can come in different ways. It could be verbal, it could be nonverbal in different ways, and making sure that they're aware of the clear ways and not making assumptions, as many young boys do. Oh, well, she said such and such, so, we have to be clear what that consent is.
I think that's really important to say that don't make assumptions. Mm-hmm. If you're unclear, don't go forward.
Absolutely, 100.
Yeah.
Get the clarity. Yeah, just get the clarity.
So Tyler, in an educational setting.
Yeah. Well, we talk about, our school counselors and health teachers. I mean, we talk about healthy relationships and, and boundaries and, social media and digital responsibility and those types of things. And so I think it's a lot of the messagings that we teach are of that of respect, mutual respect, and, healthy relationships. Those, and how to form those and maintain those over a long period of time. So, consent's certainly a large topic of conversation in the world now, and I think it's something that kids talk about, and it's part of healthy relationships.
In both of you, I'm hearing something, because you just talk about healthy relationship, and that doesn't necessarily mean sexual.
Right.
And Glenn, you talked about it, absolutely situations that aren't sexual. Mm-hmm. And so consent could be a part of any kind of situation.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes when we talk about this, when we do some trainings, we talk about culture of consent and establishing that culture. So if that's something, and let's say it's an earlier intimate relationship, two people that are just starting out dating, and there's no sex involved, there still should be consent, as you said, Glenn. Can I borrow your cell phone? Can I ask my friends to come over? Do you want to go out for pizza tonight? No one's going and saying, no, you have to have pizza, and by the way, I get to pick the toppings. No, it's a back and forth kind of thing, and absolutely get in clear. Yeah. Making sure you understand it. I know there's a lot of videos out there. We've seen, pizza comparing, or going out for dinner, comparing that to consent. And there's another popular one, T is consent, and sometimes that will work. So I think those are some resources that you can use if that works for your family or that works for your particular educational setting. Then go forward with it. If you find them to be silly, then pass on it or whatever. But there's tools out there.
And for me, I think for all of us as parents, as educators, as teachers, like we have to set the tone. Like I can remember my high school and collegiate experience to a point where the phrase, remember the phrase "no means no"? It started becoming like a joke because then guys started saying, "Well, no means no. Well, except for after yes." They would be all these cliches. We've got to set the tone. Like, no, this is a serious matter. This is serious stuff. There was a situation last summer where the kids got onto social media, Facebook, different things, and they were making posts talking about green flag, red flag. But it became a joke. Oh, his breath stinks, red flag. Well, no, red flag, green flag is a real domestic violence, principles that we teach. Let's have that serious conversation so they understand the seriousness behind those red flags, the seriousness behind those green flags, and have those conversations.
And I think that's so important because if we don't have that conversation with our kids, somebody is going to have that conversation with their kids, and we may not want that. It may be a peer who's coming up with something that's harmful or problematic, and our kids are going to absorb that.
Absolutely.
So to be on the front end and start having these conversations first with our kids, even when it's uncomfortable.
Or worst case, nobody talks to them and they continue to think it's just a joke.
Yeah, exactly.
It goes back to the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Absolutely.
So if we have those conversations, we talk about it and we talk about the seriousness of it, because if it's not taken seriously and consent is not granted, then the ending result can be serious trauma that a person can be dealing with for years or the rest of their lives. So it is a very serious topic of conversation that we must have with kids.
Jeff, I feel bad if I don't lift this up, but I think this goes back to what you were talking about with the power and control. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes in male circles, we get this idea that somehow I can use alcohol, drugs, and other things to get consent easier. Yep. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely it's a tool to use that some people will use in which to facilitate sexual assault. But consent is if a person's under the influence, and then consent very likely is not possible.
Absolutely.
And people will say, well, what's too drunk and that kind of thing. And for me, I was like, we don't need to define it like that. What we need to be able to say is just morally, is that okay to go forward?
Right.
Some people even say, if I can't get behind the wheel to drive a car, then I shouldn't be having sex. That's just a conversation to be able to have. Because I think sometimes people want to push back on that and say, well, what's too drunk and is this? And we're not going to have that conversation about what is not or is too much drunk or whatever. It is about just being a morally person, whether it's legal or not legal. Let's talk about what's morally okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for lifting that up, Jeff.
So let's see, we've got some, Tyler, you mentioned bystander intervention, and see if we have an opportunity. Glenn, you want to talk a little bit about this right here?
Yeah, I won't go real deep into it because I know they had a session very recently that talked a little bit about social media and some of the dangers and harms there. But I just wanted to lift up that, a lot of these behaviors and things that we've been talking about are displayed in that virtual setting. When we talk about bystander intervention, the same bystander that we want to see in our community is the same bystander we're hoping to see on Facebook, on Instagram, or whatever that application is to say, hey, that's not cool. You know what I mean? We got to have those strong people in the audience to lift it up and say that's not cool. Another thing with bystander intervention, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier when we were talking about the parents and how we talk to our kids. I want to make sure parents understand that if you don't have that conversation in the moment or can't have that conversation in the moment, don't feel like there's lost opportunity. When we talk about bystander intervention, there's a tactic that we call delay. Maybe in the moment isn't the best time to have the conversation. Maybe, it's your kid, you don't want to embarrass them in front of their peers or whatever it may be. But make sure you have that conversation. It could be later, it could be the next day, it could be the day after. Yep. Hey, remember Tuesday when we were at the grocery store and I saw you do X, Y, and Z? Make sure that conversation is had. It doesn't necessarily always have to be in the moment. I thought about that just a second ago as we were talking. I didn't want parents to feel like, I've got to be reactive at that moment. No, you can delay that and have that conversation later.
And I think that's a good point. It's something that I often use with talking with my own kids, because in the moment, something may be heated,
right,
or my son may be defensive.
Absolutely.
And now's not the time to have this conversation. But when he's more open, when he's more willing to have these kind of talks, that may be a better time to sit down and say, hey, let's kind of chat about this. Let's take a moment. And because sometimes we all need to kind of take a step back, cool our jets, so to speak, and then let's have that conversation about it. So when we're all more open to it.
I think too, when parents want to have that conversation, a lot of times, like you said, Jeff, our emotions are elevated.
Yeah.
We're not always making great decisions when our emotions are elevated.
Yeah.
So sometimes if we do, stop and press pause for a minute and think about what we're going to say and maybe delay that, and gives us space to take that pause and formulate a better response when we have that conversation with kids.
Good, excellent point.
But one other thing I'll just lift up really quick, Jeff, before we move to Q&A when it comes to bystander intervention. The key to bystander intervention is identifying if you have influence in that situation. It may be situations you may not be the best person to intervene, and I may want to delegate to someone else. Maybe I want to delegate to a teacher. Maybe I want to delegate to a principal. Maybe I want to delegate to a police officer. Maybe I want to delegate to someone who may be of the same sex that can have that conversation easier. So it's always about, who has the best influence to get the type of change that we want to see. So just always keep that in mind with bystander intervention. Do I have the influence to create the type of change that I want to see?
Yeah, and I've often heard the phrase, somebody doesn't have to do everything, but everybody has to do something.
Absolutely.
How's the Q&A, Tyler? Anything coming up here that we want to open up to?
Not seeing any questions yet, but we'll keep an eye on the Q&A here and see if we get some questions come in. So I guess we can go ahead and open it up to questions if people want to put those in there. Anything related to anything we've talked about, any questions for Jeff or Glenn or myself, happy to try to answer those. So we'll just keep an eye on this and see when they come up.
If it's okay, Jeff, I'll introduce a question because I know there's some guys out in the audience thinking it.
Yeah.
This is a new movement in our culture. We're trying to make some very heavy cultural shifts, cultural change. There are going to be some men in our audience who are, old school is what they say. I'm set in my ways. And I don't want you making our young men and boys soft with this type of information. How do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, and soft or this is just about sensitivity, right? This is just political correctness going amok, so to speak. And I would push back on that and say this is about leadership. When I talk to groups of men, football teams, for example, at universities, we talk about leadership and how that is so important. And so I'll use an analogy, of cheating. Mm-hmm. And if you're on a football team, for example, whatever athletic team or whatever team, anything, and you have a group of guys, and let's say there's 80 guys on a football team, right? That's a good number. And you have 8-10 guys on that team that are cheating. Right? So an absolutely small percentage of them, but they're the ones cheating. And that's helping us to win games. Mm-hmm. Now, you're not the one cheating. It's just the small percentage over there that is cheating. You're still on a cheating team. You're still on a team that is winning by cheating, whether you're the one that's doing it or not. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm talking about leadership, I'm talking about that large percentage of guys on this team that need to challenge these guys that are cheating and say that's not okay.
I don't want to win like that.
I don't want to win like that. Yeah. This isn't about just winning at all costs kind of thing. I'm going to cheat and do whatever. No. So when we start talking about preventing sexual violence, it is absolutely a small percentage of men who are perpetrating sexual violence or sexual assault, I should say, in our country. We know that research puts it around 90% of men do not commit sexual assault, and that's important because we need to get to those groups of men that are not doing a sexual assault, and for those men to just say, oh, I'm doing my part, I'm not assaulting, we need more. Yeah. We need you to step up, we need you to come forward, and we need you to challenge those men that are doing these harmful behaviors, that are doing some of the things that we saw on that power and control wheel, that are but are enacting some kind of harmful, violent behavior towards another person. And that's when I say it's about leadership.
Absolutely. And for me, I'm a parent. I've got kids. I've got kids in various ages, 28, 18, and 8. And I want the world to be a safer place for them. You know what I mean? I want them to be able to not have some of the worries that we have, some of the things that we see on the news every day, just violence as a whole. I think there's some things that we can do culturally and societal-wise to tone down a lot of the violence that we see. A lot of it comes from these isms that we see in our culture, whether it's racism, homophobia, and that list goes on and on, that
Sure.
we all have these different, hatreds about different minority groups and other marginalized groups.
Yeah.
And I think that's what kind of festers this energy towards this, violent behavior.
Yeah, because all forms of oppression are connected. If we're going to stop one form of oppression, such as racism, then we also need to address sexism because they're connected. Tyler, you're about to say something?
Yeah, we've got a question came in here. The question is, how can I help my children truly consider this topic of healthy masculinity? I know he'll agree with so much of what's been said, but I think he'll also feel it's hopeless to try to change things. So what are your reactions to that question?
Glenn, I want to kick that over to you because you and I were just having this conversation. It's about sometimes we feel hopeless.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what have we been doing over the past couple weeks?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So in this field, we're trying to do this work and make these huge cultural shifts, right? Just today, there was a huge article that came out. There was a professor down at, Shawnee State University, who refused to use gender norm pronouns. He was fired from his job. He went to the state legislature or whatever and was sued and, was awarded some money. And it became a little like disheartening because it's almost like, the state's not even supporting us. Like the law is not supporting us in this cultural change. But at the end of the day, hate wins, that ugliness wins when guys like you and I say, I give up. I give up. We'll never get to that cultural shift. It's one person at a time, one community at a time, and just continually having that conversation. Change doesn't happen overnight. I get it. And Jeff, you and I are some very passionate people, you know what I mean? But we're also choosy and we pick and choose, like the right battles to have, if that makes sense, Every time a guy, shows just a little inkling of toxic masculinity, I'm not just gonna, dude, what are you doing? You know what I mean? It's, let's have those conversations as they make sense, when they make sense, how they make sense. And it's not about being language police or being the manhood police or anything like that, but more so just, kind of setting a tone. I lead by example. I've got peers who think very, for lack of better phrasing, patriarchally, and I may not check every single statement that they make. It may just be a look. And that's enough for them to be like, I get it. I get it. Like we know who you are. We know what you represent. I get it.
And I would say in response to that as well, is because I do a lot of research around this. Because when I'm talking with and doing engaging men work, I want to be able to speak from a research perspective. Is that the vast majority of men in our country do not agree with sexist comments and sexist statements, those kinds of things. They don't agree with it. Now, the point of that is, the problem with that is, or not the problem with that, but part of that is that most men think other men agree with it. Mm-hmm. And that's what's important. So most men are thinking that other men are okay with it, when in fact they're not. So the more conversations we have, when we start to say, oh, my buddy over here actually is not okay with it, and then we start to form a union. Then we start to form some bonding in there. And so having those conversations and opening that up, and the more we get to talk with one another, then we start to find out we're not okay with it. And we start to find allies, right? And that's something, Glenn, you and I have been doing over the past couple weeks, is just batting back conversations, how we uplift and support one another. You're feeling down or whatever, like we're talking about, and I can kind of jump in and as I said, mentor. But then the reverse is also true. I'm like, feeling like, man, I'm just, beating my head against a brick wall. Sometimes you're like, dude, I know sometimes you got to step back and just take a minute and regroup, those kinds of things. So another question.
Another question here. How can I offer advice to my 7th grade son and my 9th grade nephew on how they might create healthy environments within their circle of male friends? Are there any simple, effective tips they might try?
Yeah, one of the tools I used to use in mentoring, one of the statements I used to tell young men and boys, you are the sum total of the 5 people you are around the most. Be conscious of who you're around. If they're toxic, if they're negative, over time, that'll wear on you. I'll paint a perfect example for you. Say one of those 5 guys in your circle, he likes drugs. He does drugs. That doesn't mean I'm automatically going to start doing drugs. What it does mean is one of those days I'm going to be having a very bad day. And that friend is going to say, you want to try some of this? And he's already got a little bit of influence on me. I'm having a bad day. Eventually, over time, he may be able to sway me in that direction. Doesn't automatically happen. But it's being cognizant of who your friends are, who your peer group are, and being very intentional. My grandfather, when I was growing up, he used to tell me, If you want to be a millionaire, you better find you some millionaire friends.
You know, and going back to the bystander intervention, because I was kind of thinking about that in relation to this question. I think it's so important. So every time we do bystander intervention training, we always practice. We want to practice these skills. So when I say bystander intervention, let's talk about somebody who, say, makes a sexist or racist joke. Right? And that's important that we step in and as a bystander say, you know what, I don't find that funny, or I don't think that's okay, or I don't agree with that. Or another good one is, tell me why that's funny. I don't understand. You're making this sexist joke or whatever. Tell me why that's funny, and have that person explain to you. Oftentimes it's hard for them to explain it because it's problematic. And so what I would say with that, the 7th and 9th grade kids, practice, practice, practice. As an adult, I want to sit down with my child and be able to say, I'm going to give you a scenario. I'm going to give you a situation. Tell me how you would act. And this is when the theatrics come out, right? From the parent perspective, be able to say, all right, I'm going to come in and I'm going to make this joke over. I'm going to say it. Now, we don't need to overdo it, but we absolutely need to make a real situation for your child, and be able to say, now how might you react? How might you do that? And at first that may seem uncomfortable or weird, or they may giggle or laugh, but I tell you what, and I've done this with my kids, they start to they start to get into it. They start to feel some power, like they have a place, and practice makes perfect. We hear it 100 times. And so when that situation comes up, the drug situation that Glenn just mentioned, for example, and be able to say, you know what, dude, I appreciate you offering me, but I'm good. I don't need that. What I need is, I need your friendship. I need your support, whatever it is. And so I have some of those things. So I think it is such a good thing to create that, because what we're looking at is some young boys, some young men that are really establishing some healthy norms around themselves and their group.
I think practicing is a great piece of advice, and I also think that practicing and giving kids the skills in the toolbox
Absolutely.
to be able to use in those practical situations, because the more tools they have to react to these common situations, then the more confident they're going to be to use them.
I love analogies like that. The toolbox, you're walking into a job or whatever, going into a situation, the more you have in which to use,
right,
the better off you're going to be.
And those all start with those conversations. I love the example of, tell me why you think that joke is funny.
Yeah.
Because it puts the responsibility back on the person who told the joke to explain why they think a racist joke is funny.
Mm-hmm.
Tyler, another thing I'll lift up that all parents can use. One of my favorite television shows on TV is a show that comes on ABC, and it's called What Would You Do? You can find the videos on YouTube, pull them up, different scenarios, different situations, and just pull up a video and just say to your kid, what would you do in this situation?
Yeah.
Like, how would you handle this? And that's a great way to kind of gauge where your child is, what your child is thinking, and to help lead them in the direction that we want to see them go.
Right. All right, here's another question. I think there's a chance my son's sisters are reinforcing box masculinity, as I heard one recently say, boys don't cry. Mm-hmm. Interesting comment. The girls reinforcing the male stereotypes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And it's important to point out that absolutely there are women that will reinforce that sense of what is a real man
absolutely.
and want to do that. And that's a great conversation to be able to have. I've had this conversation when we talk about the man box or being a real man, and I've had that conversation with every group of individuals. I've had it with a football team at a local college, and I've had it with young adolescent teens in a co-ed situation or mixed group situation. And when we start to break that down and really talk about what it means, because kids are going to parrot and just repeat oftentimes things that they're hearing adults say. Mm-hmm. And so if we were really to break that down and say, let's talk about this. So some of the examples that I use, and I just did this at a college last evening, is we said, talk about those things and what it means to be quote unquote a real man. What does that look like? Oh, it's tough, always in control, having lots of girls, and they went on. And I said, okay, let's put a box around that. Now, when someone goes outside of that box or falls outside of that box or moves outside of it, what kind of things do we say? And we call them the names. We call them the sissy and far worse names, right? We call them gay, those kinds of stuff. And what we start to do is we start to give a less than perspective. And so when you kind of break that down into simple simple terms. And I will note Tony Porter is a great person to watch on his TED Talk.
Absolutely.
Tony Porter, he's one of the first person to start talking about a man box. And he does a great job. And I watch his TED Talks and his YouTube videos, and it helps me to formulate a discussion. So having that discussion with the young man, how does it make you feel when you say, don't act like a girl, or you throw like a girl? How does it make you feel? And then I would say to the girl, when you're saying that, you're saying he is less than because it's a put down. Now, isn't that interesting that you are a girl and you're saying you're putting him down by calling him what you are. And you're using your own gender to put that down. And start having that real discussion. But the role model's it.
In essence, the daughter is reinforcing the stereotype and the power differential
Absolutely.
herself.
Yeah. And a lot of boys will act in that way because they're getting the message from girls, well, they want a big, strong guy. You know what I mean? Like, they think that's what the girls want, so they're trying to portray what they think the girls want. I mean, for me, we do a lot of trainings in gendered settings. I prefer having the conversation in a mixed group because girls need the information just as much as boys. One of the scenarios I'll often share so we can, start paint the picture and start changing some of those dynamics is making sure that we understand as parents, as teachers, as educators, we set the example.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is my oldest son is 28 years old. I am currently 46. I think my oldest son did not see me cry for the first time until maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I got into this work. Why? Because I hid that. I cried in private, right? But what that did was reinforcing. Men don't cry.
Yep.
It's reinforcing that. And the first time he saw it, it was like, whoa, like Dad's crying. You know what I mean? And I had to have a moment. You know what? I've cheated you because for the longest I've hid this from you. This is a natural emotion. I'll give you another example. A couple years ago, I've got my youngest are 7 and 8, boy and girl, and I bought both of them electric scooters, right? So it's Christmas morning. Go outside on an electric scooter. My son jumps on, takes off. My daughter kind of looks at it and she's a little apprehensive, right? So I give her a quick lesson, of course, show her really quick. So she hops on, takes off. First thing she does, fall, cut her leg. I run over there as Dad. Oh, baby, are you okay? You want me to kiss it? Blah, 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 blah. And then my son rose up in his scooter like, what are you doing? Last year when you was teaching me how to ride my bike, you said, suck it up, be a man. And it was literally a smack in the face to say, wow, what am I doing? How I'm reinforcing those things. So when we have these conversations with men, it's not to condemn men and say, we're bad at anyway. It's just making sure that we're aware and cognizant of the behaviors that we're displaying that are reinforcing some of these negative, things.
And having that conversation, showing that vulnerability with your kids is so important. To be able to say, you know what, I messed up. I made a mistake. And I need to do better.
Absolutely.
And when you show that vulnerability, that goes back to that leadership point that I was talking about, being a leader, right? So when we talk about what it means to be a man, someone says, well, be a leader. Well, that's another way of defining it. Being able to show your vulnerability and do it in a way that's out there for them to see and for other people to see and saying, hey, you know what, it's okay. Crying is not a feminine kind of thing.
Right.
Crying is just a way to react to an emotion, and we all should have it.
And I'm gonna paint the picture a little bigger. For me, it's not even just crying; it's empathy as a whole, which encompasses that whole bucket. As men, I've heard the quote saying, "We don't really become men until we understand that our strength is in empathy."
Yep.
And that's huge, that we have to understand empathy is a natural human emotion, and one as men we have to have in our tool bucket.
Yeah, and it's human. It's not empathy, compassion. Those
Absolutely.
aren't feminine or it's just a human
absolutely.
a trait that we all should embrace and use because that's so important.
I think that empathy discussion is really critical because it's one of the most important tenets of leadership, whether it's male or female. Yeah. The empathy is critical to being an effective leader.
Absolutely.
So I don't think that can be understated.
Yep. Any other questions up?
I'm not seeing any more questions, Jeff and Glenn. So.
And Glenn, you talked about violence and just in our culture right now, how we're seeing so much violence, and I feel like probably every generation looks at and says, "Oh, there's so much violence," and that's not to water down what we're experiencing right now. definitely levels of violence. And oftentimes I think it's that lack of connection, that lack of empathy that we have with somebody else. You know, people who commit some of these violent crimes, for example, do so in a way that they don't even look at that as a person, right? We're violent towards that person. We're harming that person in such a way, well, that's not even a person, so to speak. And we just disconnect and don't even have any sense of empathy or understanding or even try that.
And I think some of those negative behaviors come out because the fear of not knowing. You know what I mean? Yeah. I hear guys, like in the black community, I hear homophobia all the time. Yeah. And I ask, how many friends do you have that represent that community? None. Like, that's an issue. That's the problem. You don't know anybody. They're men and boys just like us. You know what I mean? Like, there's...
Yeah, so that comes to a good point. So we talked about this the other day, so I'll throw this question out there.
Absolutely.
Can a queer man be a in that masculine, be a man? Can he be a masculine?
I think so. Here's the funny thing. There are a lot of men in our culture and society who identify as queer. We may not know. And we put them on a pedestal, we idolize them. There are athletes, there are movie stars, that list goes on and on. Yeah. It's up to them when they come out. But what is ugly is, I've literally seen people say, ooh, he's gay? Oh, I don't know. Like, really? 5 minutes ago, he was your hero.
Yeah.
What just happened?
Yeah, what changed?
What he does in his personal life should have no bearing on yours.
Yeah. That's something you gotta look within yourself, and I think that's something we all gotta, not just that specific example, but going back to your example of being a better man. It's a journey. It's a path that we're all on.
Absolutely.
And we're always trying to decide: is this something I want to keep? This trait, this thing that I have right now, do I want to keep it, or is this something I need to? You know what? I need to get rid of that. I need to put that off the side. That no longer is part of my journey or path when it comes to healthy masculinity. Absolutely. And that kind of mentality or that maybe perspective towards somebody who's queer or gay or whatever, you know what, I need to set that aside because it's no longer healthy.
So thanks for coming tonight. We're going to wrap things up. So I want to just remind everyone about the short survey there, and would appreciate everyone providing feedback. So thanks a lot, Jeff and Glenn. And we talked a lot tonight about masculine and feminine boys and girls. And just want to take a moment to acknowledge the non-binary children that are out there now and experiencing that at this time.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
If you need support or resources for yourself or your child, please don't hesitate to reach out to Sarnco's 24-hour helpline at 614-267-7020. We've also created a document with all the various school districts' contact information for you. To access it, just scan the QR code on your screen. And finally, we hope you found value, knowledge, and inspiration in this session. We've placed a short survey link in the chat, and we'd love to get your feedback. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.